Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to another book chat. Okay, so today let's talk about dialect. I really enjoy dialect in books when it's done well, and it's such a tricky thing to do. And what made me think of this was I read a little article the other day, and it was about someone who had essentially invented his own language to write this whole book. And it was meant to be somewhere between, I think, Middle English and Modern English, or Old English and Modern English. Should have read the article better, probably should have printed it out and put it here, but it's just been sort of going around in the back of my mind. I was like, oh, that would be quite an interesting thing to talk about. And so he'd written the whole book in this essentially not entirely made up, but developed language, because there's not a definite, whichever era it was, there wasn't a definite guide of this is how it would have sounded, this is how people would have talked. So he kind of had to interpret that based on his research, based on what we speak now and how people spoke in the records that he did have. So I mean, that must have been a huge project. I mean, that's just amazing. You could also use other words to describe it, but it would be interesting to know how readable a book like that actually was. And I have read some books where dialect has been used and it really pulls you out of the story, because either the characters don't sound how you thought they'd sound, or it's really like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing there. I'm like some sort of old country pirate. Sorry. Yeah. I'm really bad at accents or voices or anything, so I won't do that again. Right, so the first book I read that had dialect done really, really well was Ellen Duff's Once Were Warriors. If you're not from New Zealand, you might not have come across the book. You might have come across the film, which was heartbreaking. The book was even more so. It was beautifully written, beautifully well done, and it was all written in dialect. And it would be quite interesting if you're not from New Zealand and you have read the book, how you found reading it. If you found it immersive, if you found it just hard to get into because you weren't as familiar with the accent or the ways of speaking. So if you have read it and you're not from New Zealand, or if you have read it and you are from New Zealand, let me know what you thought about it below, because for me that was a stunning book. It was just incredible. And all of Ellen Duff's books I've read actually have been really, really good. They tend to be quite hard-hitting and very emotionally quite intense. I bawled my eyes out in that book. I remember I was a teenager and I'd taken it to read, like sitting on the hill in the sun. I was like, poor dog didn't know what to do. So the other person that does dialect really, really well is, of course, Irvine Welsh, and I've got a few of his books there. So Trainspotting obviously is probably the one most of us are most familiar with. I've read a few of his, not loads. I always find them really good. They're a bit bonkers. I've read one recently. I can't remember the name of it. I don't have a copy of it here. It was about chefs, and it was so completely over the top. It was ridiculous, but very, very well written and very engaging. And always with Trainspotting, definitely, I don't know if all of his books are, but the ones I have read have all been have had at least a reasonable amount of dialect in them. And I remember the first time I read Trainspotting, it took me ages to get into it, but once I got into it and I could, you started hearing the words in your head, you could actually read quite normally, and it was a very, very effective technique. So my question for you today is, do you enjoy books done in dialect? What books have you read done in dialect which have been really well and have really helped the story, as opposed to being kind of a little bit gimmicky or even pulling you out of the story? Country pirates aside, I don't know what that was, I'm really sorry. And yes, give me your best dialect below. And yeah, that is all for today. Thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.